The colony's experimentation of paper money from Massachusetts in 1690 to the 1740s brought the states great prosperity, but soon was all about to change. As merchants throughout the times of the French and Indian War wanted the colonies to discontinue with their colonial scripts. The first Currency Act of 1751 was a restriction of paper dollars to acquire more gold for England. After this policy failing because the colony's continuous use and practice of paper money, the colonies still enjoyed a functioning economy. Angry pressure from British bankers and pressure from British merchants soon pushed Parliament to outlaw the colonial currency completely. After Benjamin Franklin's meetings with the British Board of Trade and Parliament, the Currency Act of 1764 was passed, totally nullifying paper money's use and value in commerce. After Parliament passing the Currency Act of 1764, the Bank of England pressured the colonies to use England's own form of semi-fiat paper currency, created by a method of fractional reserve banking. Why did England want the colonies to end their use of paper money? The difference between the two currencies was that England's paper money was issued by a privately owned central bank, an organization not fully owned by a nation or its people, and was not interest-free like the colony's paper money. This meant that every pound or dollar loaned out had interest attached, with obligation from the other party to have to pay back the interest, also known as usury or money laundering. Today, we know this as a Ponzi scheme where debts get paid through new money that's waiting to be created. So, when the government creates new currency, it creates debt, to be paid off with future money, creating more debt to pay off the original debt on the currency. This idea of letting out each dollar with interest attached was a form of Bank of England's fractional reserve banking that has influenced many national banking practices around the world today to practice to lend interest to their national currencies. This illustrates America and the early roots of modern banking that relate into today. This is the Hidden Hands of History podcast, finding diamonds in the rough of history that have become neglected or forgotten. One of the most important perspectives on understanding the Revolutionary War is the relationship between the American colonies and the British West Indies. One cannot fully understand the Revolution without understanding the importance of the West Indies to the British and the West Indies' dependence on trade and commerce with the mainland American colony. The West Indies was a huge, significant source of wealth to the British and their empire around the globe. In fact, George III regarded the possessions of the islands as essential for generating the wealth for the war and to preserve national greatness. This trading relationship between the colonies and the British West Indies was strong, with tightly intertwined economies trading paper money and hard currencies for sugar, rum, and slaves. The American colonies were a wealth to the West Indies, receiving most of their fish, oak, oats, corn, candles, flour, butter, soap, 2/3 their cattle and livestock, and around half their slaves. Interestingly, this reliance of trade between the two colonies was broken as a result of the Revolutionary War, cutting off trade, completely stifling Great Britain's global war finances, a great advantage for the 13 colonies. In fact, the West Indies were so important for England during the Revolutionary War that 5,000 troops were taken from New York to take back St. Lucia from the French, known as the Battle of St. Lucia on December 15th in 1778.
People don't realize how much the West Indies had a lot to do with the economy between the mainland colonies of America and then the British, because they're considered both American colonies actually, of the British West Indies. The Indies were a big contention of not just owned by the English, it was the Dutch, it was the Spanish, it was the French. And so they were constantly taking over different spots. And basically what the British West Indies were a sugar gold mine. It was a place that the American colonies would buy sugar and slaves and rum, because of course you make the sugar with the rum. So that actually, interestingly enough, according to even King George III, he claimed that this economy going back and forth of just alone of them buying sugar. Here's the quote. These island colonies were essential for generating wealth to the war and preserving national greatness. This is from King George III. So he knew that in order for England to have kind of this extra finance to fund its wars abroad, it was essential that there was a connection between the economy of 13 colonies and the British West Indies. And the trading relationship was very intertwined to the point where I would say we were the breadbasket for
Yeah, no,
Indies.
I mean, right, it doesn't make sense. If you're in the West Indies, it doesn't make sense to spend any resources growing food. You put everything into growing sugar, into producing sugar. And you take the enormous profits that you make from sugar and you buy the pork, the grain,
Right.
the corn, the peas, whatever it is that whatever it is that you have that you need to feed, cotton for kind of the rudimentary
Right,
clothes
right.
that the enslaved persons on those plantations, would wear. But again, if you go back to your core Adam Smith, you invest in what you're really good at producing and what
Right.
you can make the most profit, and then you buy the other stuff that's less efficient for you. And they were doing that. They were
Right.
doing that.
Right. Simple law economics, like it makes a lot of sense. And so yeah, they were kind of not really Londoners, but those British, colonists, they made a lot of money. However, even though we were the breadbasket for them, we actually gave them most of their fish, most of their oats, candles. I mean, I looked at it, said butter, flour. 2/3 of the cattle livestock came from us going to them. Like you said, they just keep buying things, and around half their slaves. So there was a really, really strong alliance between the two. And one thing the British didn't really count on was as soon as they basically went to war with us, that connection of trade was broken off, and a little bit of their wealth financing wars were kind of, not that it totally stopped the British, but it kind of hurt their wallet just a bit.
Well, and the West Indies had to come up with a plan B. I mean, and there was a hope that the West India colonies might join the revolutionary movement.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, if you look during the Stamp Act era, and it's one of the pieces that I put into my book on the Stamp Act, that there's opposition to it in Jamaica and some of the other places, some of the other colonies, Antigua, can't think of the other one off the top of my head, trying to also frustrate it. But the West India colonies with a enormous enslaved population needed the protection of the British Navy. They need the protection of the British Army. They can't take the risk of any kind of revolt or rebellion in the same way that the mainland colonies can. And so it makes sense that the West Indian colonies would actually not side with the Americans and
Right.
stay in Great Britain. But there's a hope that again, those economic connections and some of the proximity and some of the other things, and if the West Indies wanted to join America, then they would have been welcome, but it didn't make sense for them.
Interesting. And even after the revolution, it was always looked at as like, when are we trading with them again?
Well,
When
and
is
it opens.
yeah.
I mean, maybe we'll get to it, but it opens back up.
Absolutely. I kind of am alluding to that. Another thing I thought was interesting is there's actually the Battle of St. Lucia, where I don't really remember exactly what part of the revolution, but basically 5,000 troops were taken out of New York because St. Lucia was hit by the French, so England wanted to take it back. So if that doesn't show you how important the West Indies were to the English, they actually stopped fighting a battle just to get it back. But we were like, hold on, America.
To a certain extent, those colonies are more important.
Yeah, to a certain
from
right.
From an economic perspective, they're definitely more important.
Right, and also maybe a military perspective too, because then you can still invade other smaller islands. Of course, we talked about the contention between those three empires: Dutch, French, Spanish, British. So the first letter I actually got that alluded this whole journey for me with the West Indies was from John Kean it was in the Liberty Hall, and I got a letter. It was a South Carolina representative, a guy named, I hope I'm not butchering his name, John Pritchard Grime.
Okay.
I think that's how you pronounce it. And he basically was a associate justice of the state of South Carolina. He also served as a state legislator briefly. And in the letter, it talked about Cape Francis, but it was spelled kind of differently, like Fracnios. I have to really emphasize that because when you put it on a search, different things come up. So I'm wondering what is the whole point of this, and why is that relevant, and why the spelling is kind of off. But basically, it was a letter showing that the revolt that America had right before, well, basically the Cape of France is the Cape of Haiti, basically. Right. And it was a letter regarding just how there was a slave revolt with a French colony, Haiti. And basically it was John Kean kind of worried about, almost because he bought and sold a lot of slaves. So that was Haiti. If you couldn't go and go to the regular British West Indies, we were trading with the French. So that was looked at as kind of like a worry and a concern that you can't really get a trading point to get your slaves to make profits.
And a slave revolt. I mean, the slave revolt in Haiti and the revolution in Haiti is huge news. I mean, talking about history that we don't know about. I mean, but people like John Kean were really worried that it portended a slave. I mean, the demographics are different, but that it portends a revolt by these enslaved persons in America too. And there's fear of it being exported. And I'm not surprised that there's a lot of consternation about it.
Right, there was fear that it would happen here as a result, right? Yeah, very, very interesting. So that was the first thing I actually saw that this is really important that America had this interest with the West Indies. So that's how I came with the other research looking into it. That was like literally the Pandora's box for me.
Alexander Hamilton was a financial genius and an economic prodigy who saw potential of a new nation and a new banking system. In order to comprehend this mindset of creating a new type of banking system for the United States, we must first understand the background of Alexander Hamilton, the founding father most responsible for the creation of the first bank. Alexander Hamilton was born in the West Indies on the island of Nevis, in Charlestown, on January 11, 1757. In his early years, Hamilton first exposed to international commerce, including slave trade, working as a clerk in a mercantile trading business. Learning about money and trade, Hamilton's boss valued Hamilton's abilities concerning his accounting, and other businessmen pooled their resources along with a minister and a newspaper editor named Hugh Knox to send Hamilton to the American colonies eventually for education. Hamilton was a student of finance and a unique talent for his time, and in his free time, endlessly studying European and British finances, always being an admirer of the Bank of England. During the war, Hamilton joined forces with Patriot soldiers in New York of an artillery company in their protest against English-imposed taxes and commercial business regulations. Washington recognized Hamilton's military leadership skills and his astonishing talent for writing and accounts, promoting him as lieutenant colonel, only 20 years at the time, which later, of course, serving as Secretary of Treasury on Washington's staff, being the first Secretary of Treasury at the age of 32 years old, serving from 1789 to 1795. Between the years after Revolution and prior to serving as Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton received his law license, defending British loyalists and protecting their property and rights after the Revolutionary War.
Talk about how important Alexander Hamilton is, because he is almost the first person to establish credit in this country. Talk about the West Indies important. Alexander Hamilton was actually born in the West Indies on January 11th, 1757. They're actually not even sure about that date.
There's
right.
The
see?
date is disputed.
Yeah, see? History nerd stuff. So what is...
Lin-Manuel made us all
really?
super knowledgeable.
Super knowledgeable? Okay.
About Alexander Hamilton.
So what is the other date then? If it's not this, is it a year or two off?
I think it's 2 years earlier.
Okay.
So I think there's a question of 55 or 57. And Hamilton is interested in making himself appear younger, actually, because it makes his kind of
legacy,
prodigiousness even that much more impressive if he's a little bit younger.
Man, you're right. Because when I was reading this, I'm like, man, he's that young doing this?
Right.
Yeah, you're right.
So having it, 1755, he still would have been young, but it looks a little differently, and they didn't keep birth certificates the same.
Right,
that
exactly.
we did. So you could fudge the dates.
You would think like, oh, we know all the dates. It's not that far ago with these founding fathers. No, there's a problem right there. We're not sure. So anyway, he was kind of his interesting background is he's exposed to commerce at a really early age, and even the workings of like the slave trade. He works as an accountant under a merchant in a trading business in St. Croix. I'm not sure where that is. Learning about trade and money. And he had a boss named Nicholas Kruger, who was actually so impressed with Hamilton's ability on accounts and just being kind of a really good businessman, that he pulled resources with his boss, a minister, and a newspaper editor to kind of fund his education to the colonies. So he did such a good job, and he had kind of like, I think his father passed, he had kind of like a broken childhood kind of thing. And so his work was his life, impressed his boss so much that eventually the student of finance and talent, because he always studied British finances, he was a big fan of the Bank of England even at a young age. About 1773, the finances put him to King's College. So the merchant, his boss, all that, actually goes to King College, which actually is Columbia University in modern day. So he actually went to a very good school.
We want to go to Princeton. He didn't get in.
Oh, you really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Why did he not be able to get in?
Well, he wanted an accelerator. You need to go listen to the Hamilton musical. I mean,
I did not.
It's all in there.
Oh wow.
But yeah, he wants this accelerated program and all this stuff, and Princeton tells him he's not ready. And
wow.
So he goes to King's College.
Wow, mistake. Definitely should have accepted him, right? That's crazy. See, that's what I love too. There's so much that I could spend hours. And of course, it's a very broad subject, and I still may not get certain details, and that's awesome. That's fun.
But history's not the details necessarily. I mean, you can use the details to illustrate it, but it shouldn't be a trivia contest.
Right.
It should be a story.
True. So another thing I thought was interesting too is that he had such knowledge about graphs on the even financial and political just issues in America and England. He had anonymous pamphlets that were actually issued, and he was only 17 years old at the time. And basically, he leaves King's College to go join Patriot forces for the Revolution. I think they're a New York artillery company. And basically, they were opposed to British taxes and commercial business regulations. Washington sees Hamilton's leadership skills and his talent for writing and accounting and stuff. So he actually puts him as an advisor. And you have him serving basically, this is the really interesting, kind of hard to put my finger on to articulate. He basically is in the Revolution, serves, and he becomes the secretary, of course, the first secretary from 1789 to 1795. But I found this very interesting. Between the years, because he was 32 when he did as a secretary, and then with Washington, he's 20 years old at the time when he's lieutenant for Washington. So between the years of him actually being secretary and after the war, he becomes a lawyer. But he's a lawyer receiving his license defending property rights of British loyalists. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So you see, and Dr. Nicholson made a good point of this kind of idea too. You have people that fought in the Revolution, it seems like they're against the British, but there's kind of like a sympathetic kind of thing towards them still. And it's much like how, and I don't have her source for this, but she did say this, Benjamin Franklin didn't own any slaves. But there's a story about him going to France, somebody having a slave that escapes, and he helps them. Well, why would a guy that doesn't have any slaves help somebody? You really have to understand the times and what was accepted to the point where...
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that story per se. I mean, on the British stuff more generally, I mean, there's still a lot of respect for the British system.
Absolutely.
Which, I mean, I also think, to your argument of that this is more about financial and economic concerns. I mean, it speaks to that, where they're still, it speaks to two things, right? One, which is that there's probably more than just frustration with the system, and two, that it was a really profound decision to rebel, because they did for a long time they identified themselves as British well into the 1760s and even into the 1770s. People living in America would have identified themselves as British. Right. And so ultimately making that decision, it wasn't quick, and we shouldn't have expected it to be. I mean, I think now we look, it's like obvious. America should have been independent.
Right.
For the men, at least in Philadelphia, it's a more profound decision.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's a good point to make that not only financially, we're still taking British ideas, even with law, a lot of our stuff, even today, a lot of our stuff from law.
Still an important training partner for us.
That's still a big deal. they're the daddy. They were literally we I don't know how you want to say it, but we basically there wouldn't be any ideas of capitalism without their mercantilism and everything else. They were literally we're almost one in a sense. Hamilton proposing this idea for a national bank was based off his idea and love for the Bank of England. Hamilton actually knew the difference between the French and British empires to the point where he knew that the financial system of England was more superior. There's actually a guy in the 18th century named John Law. He's a Scottish economist who becomes a controller of finance for France. And he looks at like there's two bubbles that happen. One's the Mississippi bubble of 1720. Of course, the French owned that area of land, and how the French couldn't really stop that bubble. The English had a Southern Sea bubble during the same time. It was a trading thing with ships, and they were able to overcome that bubble with their better modern financial system of the Bank of England. So it was more developed. England was the first to industrialize over France, and as a result, the system survived while the French one kind of stifled. Britain won most of their wars between 1688 to about 1776, right? And we have a widespread empire, and they also, with their Magna Carta, has an influence on constitutional government. So we see that France, of course, lost most of its wars with England and nearly went bankrupt and having a bloody revolution, had eventually, lost its colony to slaves. So Hamilton saw these strengths and weaknesses and knew that if he actually made a system that America had using paper money credit as only the really difference between Bank of England, he could have almost like a new financial revolution strengthening the economy.
Before I go describing about the first bank of the United States and why it's so important, and what basically led to a financial revolution, we must first understand what a central bank is. It's an organization that issues and regulates currency of an entire country. Powers of the central bank include the use of interest rates and the growth and reduction of the money supply of that nation. However, there is a very easily distinct difference between a national bank and a central bank. Central bank does not just give money to the government or hold it. It merely loans it to that country with interest. Then, by having the power to increase and decrease the money supply in order to change the value of the money supply, meaning the central bank has the ability to control and adjust the value of money circulating in the system at any given time. A national bank has the same abilities as a central bank without loaning any interest attached to their dollar. It just simply prints or coins the money itself. Another characteristic of a central bank is that most of the bank's ownership is of foreign investors. As well, the first bank of the United States is interesting because historians and scholars argue over whether it being a central bank or not. Although most claim yes, because of our early financial system being based clearly off the Bank of England, in which Alexander Hamilton claimed. Others say it's a national bank that transitioned to a central bank, just to try and manage the money from the war debt. December 12, 1791, the first U.S. national bank was established with a 20-year charter. From 1791, the charter ended until 1811. The bank started with a capitalization of $10 million, with $2 million which was held by the government, and the remaining $8 million held by private investors. A huge sum of money back in that era. Investors paid $25 per scrip for a partial share, and investors needed to pay $400 for a full share. The owner of the share was forced to make divided payments, $100, 1/4 in specie, and 3/4 in U.S. debt. The size of the capitalization made for the first bank not only was the largest financial institution in the new nation, but it also was the largest corporation of any type so far. The shares of the bank were also the largest initial public offerings in this country to date. However, with many initial investors being foreign, and even though they couldn't vote, the detail did not sit well with many Americans, in the belief the huge volume of shares would still give them great influence.
So in December 1790, there's a proposal that Hamilton puts out to Congress. And it's about why it's important to have this first Bank of the United States. Its main goal of the Bank of the United States, the first bank, was to resolve the issue of debt and fiat currency by, of course, paying off the revolutionary debts. The charter actually was based completely off the same charter of Bank of England. he argued that this version would be a little bit different. Like I said, issuing paper notes, and it would be a place to keep, its job to keep funding for the public, collecting taxes, being a financier of the government, and offering bank combinations as well as commercial transactions. So it dealt with individuals and business, where apparently Bank of England dealt more commercial than individual. It's great you know that, because like a lot of times people are like, huh, quoi? So under the resemblance of the two, there are key differences as well as that. The Bank of England, under Bank of England, shareholders had one vote. Hamilton's plan, it depended how much shares you owned of the Bank of the United States in order to have voting rights. If you were a foreign holder, you had say but no actually voting power. So you could own stocks in the Bank of the United States, but you couldn't actually have any voting rights to push anything. There were a maximum ratio between loans of specie and gold. Bank of England didn't have that. So in other words, they were limited on like loans you could put out for busts. The most significant is actually the government only owned about 20% of the bank, and it only owned 20 million of that. That was the shares, 20 million. 2 million, and then it only had 20% of the shares, where the other ones were held by the foreign investors. There were about 8 million. So Bank of England was privately owned. Both banks were kind of forbidden to hold values and trading commodities. We kind of talked about that before. They weren't allowed to trade in tobacco or wood or anything that were commodities. So just before this was actually going to be pushed through, Jefferson and Madison were in fear that this new bank would link ties to the government and actually put wealthy business class to be more closely related with the government. Despite the opposing voices in the House, Hamilton actually got what he wanted. And by the winter of 1791, President Washington, kind of on the fence of the bill, before he vetoes it, he actually takes almost like a dissertation of what the Attorney General at the time says. I think his name is Emin Randolph, and Thomas Jefferson. And he takes kind of their writings, shoots it to Hamilton, gives him a week to kind of refute what they say. So within a week, Hamilton stays up like sleepless nights and delivers you think this is a lot, 15,000 words refute on why it's important Washington needs to sign for this bank. And it gets passed. The first bank gets passed, and where did I put it? Should have put it. In December 12th, 1791. And with a 20-year charter. So the charter will go from 1791 to 1811. Now, before I actually go into it, a lot of people get confused with the Bank of North America. I was reading stuff, and some of them actually are giving credit to like the National Bank for what the Bank of North America, and I actually had to read a couple JSTORY articles to go, oh, this guy's actually wrong. Those are two different banks. So only thing you need to know about the Bank of North America was it was used to kind of finance during the Revolution when there was no central bank. And the only good thing it really did was set up branches that actually are located in nation's ports. It made it easier to collect taxes. Hamilton didn't like branches apparently at first, but then when bust happens, it actually was really convenient. This was a huge sum of money back then, and the Caesar capitalization was actually, bank was the largest financial institution at the time so far, and the shares were the largest initial public offering to the date in this country. So I thought that was interesting.
That's cool. I didn't know that.
Yes.
Yeah.
You think of Apple, you think of all these other things on our markets, on a stock market. This bank, our first one, had the biggest IPOs. And since many of this was known that publicly there were foreign investors and that many of them couldn't vote, this didn't hold well with a lot of Americans. And basically, there was a lot of contention and argument whether this bank was even constitutional or really should happen. With these initial public offerings, these were such big offers and they got bought up so quick that it actually made inflation, and it actually made it kind of an unstable market for states when they were trying to get a hold of these stocks, whether it be individuals or actually state governments.
Initially, this IPO caused a huge speculation on the previously issued war bonds. Speculators with inside knowledge of the plan knew the government would pay in full face value of the bonds. These speculators searched in different states to find unsuspecting farmers or ignorant people who held bonds to sell their bonds for pennies on the dollar, taking advantage of the system.
More change than I could have imagined, Mr. Hamilton. But I've been, as you know, in revolutionary France, where the streets are filled with the songs of liberty and brotherhood and the overthrow of ancient tyrannies of Europe, and to return from there to this, our cradle of revolution, and find the dinner table chatter is all of money and banks and authority is an unwelcome surprise.
Unwelcome, perhaps, but necessary.
I must admit, Mr. Hamilton, I'm a little uncertain as to the purpose of the Treasury Department. No doubt its function will reveal itself to me in good time.
The future prosperity of this nation rests chiefly in trade. Trade depends, among other things, on the willingness of other nations to lend us money.
And how would you propose to establish international credit?
Our first step would be to incur a national debt. The greater the debt, the greater the credit. And to that end, I have recommended to the President that Congress adopt all the debts incurred by the individual states during the war through a national bank. The idea being that if the states owe Congress money, then other nations will feel more inclined to lend it to us.
If the states are indebted to a central authority, it increases the power of the central government.
You have it exactly. The greater the government's responsibility, the greater its authority.
The moneyed interest in this country is all in the north, so the wealth and power would inevitably be concentrated there in the federal government, to the expense of the south.
If that is the case, it is unavoidable if the Union is to be preserved.
I fear our revolution will have been in vain if a Virginia farmer is to be held in hock to a New York stock jobber, who in turn is in hock to a London banker. The opportunities for avarice and corruption would certainly prove irresistible.
Well, there you have it, as I have heard said. If men were angels, then no government would be necessary.
The National Bank's initial public offer triggered an economic crisis over the bank's shares within the first weeks, creating inflation on prices of the stock. Many scholars are unfamiliar with the Panic of 1792, but it's so important to the creation of modern economic theory and policy that with all of Alexander Hamilton's wisdom would be put to the test at America's very first financial crisis, the Panic of 1792, spread. Alexander Hamilton's techniques and genius utilized contemporary central banking practices that were both decades and even centuries ahead of his time. Ahead of central bank chairman 81 years prior to Breguet's concepts known as Breguet's Law, written in 1873 in his book Lombard Street. Breguet's idea of implementing loans with high interest during crisis while making good on banking agreements on rates of advances, which Hamilton clumsily stumbled upon. In this panic, Hamilton's methods also birthed the influence of the modern stock exchange. All of Hamilton's financial skills were put to the test, and his importance in Washington's administration was shown as the financial crisis very well had the potential to monetarily ruin the newly birthed nation of the United States. Because basically what happened, there's a panic of 1792, and basically it kind of puts Hamilton's knowledge to the test, his economic prowess, let's just say. And basically he almost stumbles upon doing techniques that are crisis management techniques, very similar to like what the Federal Reserve does today. There's the tech bubble that Alan Greenspan had in 2001, the dot-com bubble, and it was the same management techniques that the 2007 crisis management thing with Ben Bernanke. And it seems to be the same ideas that are used now are being used with Hamilton back then. He even does this other thing where there's something called Breguet's Law, where this guy actually makes these things, like, I guess it's about 80 years after. So it's amazing that he stumbles accidentally through a crisis to kind of fix these initial public offers. One of the weirdest things is that he actually told the bank to kind of halt on the credit that they had. He was like, let's not print any more money and let's just kind of see where this goes. The banks put too much of a brake on it and actually peddles the prices even more out of control. So one of the more interesting things I have to point out is how the way the stock was. It was about $25 for just a partial share, but if you wanted a full share, it was $400, and you had to have buy about $100 worth of the U.S. debt, and then you had to do the other quarter in specie. So in about the first couple weeks, the prices started to change because everybody bought up these IPOs. So making a huge speculation in the market, people wanted to get these things. So within the first 6 weeks of BUS, the first bank in the United States, it went from 25, and then in August it went up to a share, the partial share, 300. And then within just a little more weeks, it went up even more. And so recognizing this price shift, Hamilton had to utilize like one bank that was very important, and it was the Bank of New York. And it's actually headed by William Senton, who's basically going to be the person who replaces John Kean at the first national bank. Now, the most probably interesting thing I thought is that Senton is very much a pessimist economically with this crisis. He doesn't really think that it's going to go over well, and there's constantly letters between Hamilton and William back and forth on him trying to just get him to ease his conscience on the crisis. But it gets to the point where Senton goes, we're going to actually sever our relationship, because I'd rather protect myself from the crisis than actually hold on to these U.S. scripts, let's just say. So basically, Hamilton's armed with those Braggett's laws. Before that, he has this repurchase kind of plan, and he basically convinces these banks not to withdraw any money, any gold, for about 3 or 4 months, which actually kind of helps the economy stabilize. He also does something to implode the federal debt. He goes and takes out Dutch loans, just to temporarily offset the debt management, which are actually similar techniques now. You implement high interest rates, and then you loan them out as interest, and they try and put it into sections of the economy that basically will almost make a bubble, and you can withstand temporarily, a crisis. Pretty much very similar to today.
We're trying to get more investment back into that, right? You got to get the money circulating again.
Exactly.
And Hamilton was particularly aware of that, of the need for, we talked about paper money last time, especially in the rest of it, and the need to just have a circulating medium to facilitate exchange, to facilitate economic activity.
Right, because if you don't have enough exchange, you're left with a barter system.
Right.
Like this crisis, pretty much, if it wasn't worked out well enough, if it wasn't handled well enough, we wouldn't really have a country today. It's a financial revolution, you could almost look at it as well as after the regular revolution. So this could have really, really just put the brakes on America's, industrial revolution, financial revolution.
Well, and it's still controversial. Just as a lot of economic stuff today is controversial. But then it's, how much economic activity do we really want? Or do we want to be essentially a nation of small bartering farmers and a fear of, fear of bank? The fear of banks is a thread throughout American history. Look at the populists and other groups, during the Depression and other kinds of things of what do we do with the banks, the saving and loan crisis in the 1990s, right? But what should, it gets down to what should America be when it grows up, or as it's trying to grow up? It's that classic Jeffersonian, versus Hamilton kind of.
Right. He wanted more of an agrarian society.
Yeah. That independence comes from owning your own land and being able to produce your own stuff.
Right.
You buy 1 or 2 goods from the store, but for the most part, you're producing it for yourself, as opposed to. I'm going to do whatever it is I'm good at and make money and use that money to buy all the things that are less efficient, right?
Which, even though I'm going off track, slightly kind of similar to how everybody's trying to get off the grid kind of now. We were so independent back then. I feel like we're so dependent.
Well, but it's really hard, right?
Oh yeah,
it's really hard to actually do that.
We live in the age where you want our time to be more available to do other things, and that was the age where all your time was to get food or work.
Right. If you're spending all your time growing food, then you don't have any time to do a whole lot else.
Precisely. Probably the coolest thing I didn't really understand until this sole main purpose of this crisis, what came out of it, the most, I would say, significant, is the creation of the New York Stock Exchange. Apparently, it was May 17th, it was the same year, 1792, Hamilton met with about 24 New York brokers, and he was apparently under this buttonwood tree on Wall Street. So this is how Wall Street gets its name. So he implements with the Bank of New York and these new, let's just say, skills and ideas of trade, stuff that's kind of allowed today. And he used these kind of brokers to kind of expand the credit, introduce these new techniques, and actually kind of, again, kind of prop the economy up just a little bit more, add more investors to kind of, make it more financially stable. So understanding this problem, as soon as he did this, it took a couple months for Hamilton to realize it. Within getting to this point in New York Stock Exchange, it only took him, with doing the gold halting and then using this new financial investor strategy, it took him a month, and the financial crisis was done with. So I really thought that was pretty amazing, actually.
No, he's a smart dude.
Because, really?
Original thinker, all of those kind of classic phrases that you would use. He has it. Yeah, he has it.
Definitely. And like I told you before, he was not one of particularly a founding father that I liked, but it really goes to show you, like, what would we have done if we didn't have a guy like that,
Yeah.
And also, he never wrote any of this down. So he actually could have been more historically put on a pedestal of, like, this political science, this economic philosophy.
Well, that's what the musical is. Did you listen to the
I did
musical?
not, I did not.
Even I listened to the musical some this weekend. So you've got to listen to it because that's what made Hamilton. To my mind, that's what has made Hamilton so relevant and so prominent in the popular eye now. Just in the last several years, is the musical and what a huge hit it was. And,
right.
And, genre redefined. It's redefined Broadway, and you'll never look at Broadway. I'm not the biggest Broadway person.
Yeah,
You'll
I actually
look
never
at
watched
Broadway the same. But if you pay attention to the lyrics and you can look into some of the supplemental stuff that's come out too. It's really extraordinary.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary.
I will have to take a look
Yeah,
at it. I actually will.
it's worth listening to for sure. You'll love it.
I'm more of a Jefferson guy. When they could do a Jefferson musical.
He's got Jefferson in there plenty. Although
Okay.
Jefferson's
There's problems with Jefferson.
the antagonist. Yes.
Also, to understand the first bank, one has to know to also look at John Kean, the first cashier of the first Bank of the United States. John Kean may have been one of the best financiers of his time, second to Alexander Hamilton. John Kean was born in Charleston, South Carolina, May 4th, 1756. John Kean was an American merchant, banker, South Carolina politician, and a member of the Continental Congress. During the war, he served as a deputy paymaster of South Carolina's militia, which, later during the siege of Charleston, John Kean was taken as a prisoner of war by the English. As a prisoner on sea, John Kean was confirmed aboard a British prison ship for several months that led him to developing a respiratory disease that plagued him until his death in 1795. Soon after the Constitution was written, John Kean was appointed as the first cashier of the first Bank of the United States because of his impressive knowledge in finances and accounting skills.
But we have to understand a certain thing about banks during that time. Now banks don't have charters. Back then they had to implement kind of a worth to society, whether it was building roads or some type of value that was limited. And charters would be 10 years or it'd be 20 years. So basically, the first Bank of the United States, BUS, was used to kind of calculate the debt for the war. That was its purpose, is to try and repay back from the state debt, which was about 25 million, and then the federal debt, which is about 5 million. So in comes John Kean, and one of the reasons that we played with this new financial system was the Articles of Confederation limited the amount of federal authority to levy, taxes from everybody. So it's a no-brainer that you would take the Constitution, and with this power federally, you have kind of a fun little new system financial game. So basically, John Kean, he was a debt collector for individuals in the states. I'm not going to say he was like a bookie looking for money, but he was the guy kind of on you, like, hey, we need to pay this back, and this needs to be in a value of specie or gold, not just all this paper stuff. So looking at the loans and stuff that he, and the payments and all that, I actually, before looking at the National and Federal Archives, which I had to get special permission for, there was a personal letter. And one of the personal letters that started out was actually from a letter that he had to the Senate, and it was about the numbers were all wrong. He's getting on the Senate and then the Speaker of the House saying, hey, these loans, these prices, these numbers are off, and until you get them regular down to a specie level, then we can actually pay this back. And pretty much it's a letter of April 29th, 1790, and it says, we feel it cannot be perfectly satisfactory, because it does not show the real amount of the claims of the states, nor can it be done until the monies claimed are reduced to special value, which depend upon the final accumulation of amounts. So basically, it was so crazy, the inflation, and trying to get the country back to kind of a normalcy, that even the states, even the Senate couldn't, and the House couldn't really make sense of it.
Well, and each state has its own valuation too, right? So you're dealing with essentially 13 plus federal valuations as opposed to just one. So
Oh, right.
The
So you're
math
going
is-
off their numbers
right.
and then 13.
The math. And well, and it's hard to keep up, and the math is really difficult.
Absolutely.
The math is really difficult without a calculator, especially. I mean,
Right,
this
right.
is-
They just write, like, you know,
this is-
the whole stamp
Look,
back.
I mean,
and
you've
paper
looked at
thing.
his stuff.
Yeah.
He's got marginalia of math
Everywhere.
problems and long division and addition and things like that everywhere. I mean,
Oh,
it's cool in its own way, I think.
It is, and then you'll find like little stuff on the back, like constitutional philosophy
Yeah,
kind
right.
of things, you know.
No, he's just it's the jotting down on a napkin or on a post-it. I mean, I
Right.
think of him as kind of what would John Cain have done with post-its?
Yes,
would
yes,
be really
yes.
kind of.
What would
be really
Jesus
kind
do?
of
What would
cool.
John Cain do? Yeah, you know, like it really shows. Like even now, I do that, and I was like, oh, who does that? I do that in my notebook with notes. So like, it is something that still continues. And another thing, because you wrote an article on the relationship between Susan and
Yeah.
him with the letters going back and forth. And would you call that a Republican?
It's a
motherhood?
Yeah, I mean, it's Republican motherhood in
Motherhood.
in its own way. I mean, she's engaged, and he's engaged. You know, he recognizes her as someone that he can rely on for information. You know, she's connected. You know, she's a Livingston, so that he can get the information that he can't get or can't so easily get when he's down in South Carolina. And how, I mean, she's not the topic that we're talking about, but
Right.
Susan's fascinating and someone that I don't have as full of an under, you know, I think she's hard to get a full understanding of. Just we don't, you know, we have a lot of his letters because he sent them up here, but her letters that were sent down to him, I think we have 3,
Oh wow.
which is one of the huge frustrating pieces with trying to understand that correspondence. Is we have a 40 or 50 letters from him. I mean, it's a tremendous collection. But from her, it's much harder. The ones we have are tremendous, but it's a much more limited sense of herself and trying to understand who she is. But we know that she's a savvy businesswoman. I mean, she's, you know, after John Cain's, not to spoil it, but John Cain dies. After John Cain dies,
Spoiler.
you know, she's making the economic decisions, and sometimes those have to be done. You know, her son is having to actually execute them just because of the rules of the time. But it's clear. You know, she's buying and selling shares in the Santee Canal River Company back in South Carolina and making determinations and distinctions with regard to what, you know, land is going to be sold or what purpose it's going to be used for, and investing, you know, investments in this area, in the Elizabeth area, as well as down in the Carolinas and Georgia. So.
It's interesting because like it's funny you said that because when I keep reading the letters, he's like, it's good to hear from you, Susan. I'm like, she doesn't care. She's not writing back that much. But
No,
now,
she is.
now you're
Yeah,
telling me
yeah.
that you just
No, I
don't
mean,
have as many letters.
She if you read, when you read those letters, you know, some of it is just the style of the time. He definitely writes more. I mean, he's constantly
yes.
complaining, like, you know, you should have received my letters of the 7th, the 14th, and the 28th, and I haven't heard anything from you
Yeah,
since
yeah.
yours of 2 months ago.
Right.
And
there's no
I don't
text,
think
cell
it's
phone.
because the mail is that inefficient between New York and South Carolina. I think that she just doesn't write. But you know, that's one of the interesting pieces with trying to understand her is that she doesn't, you know, getting married was something that you did, and so they got married, and then, you know, she's widowed at pretty early on. I mean, that John Cain only lives for, I think, 8 or 9 years that they're married before he dies. And then she elects to get remarried, and she didn't really have to do that.
Yeah.
But of course, the man she marries leaves for Poland like 6 or 7 years later, and they never see each other. I mean, they're married for 25 years. They basically never see each other again. So, which I think worked for her. I mean, I think that was actually her. You know, they only have one kid, and there was one, and I've never been able to recreate my thought on it. There's one where it looked like maybe she miscarried. She had a miscarriage, but typically families then had more than one kid just because mortality in childbirth and
Right.
and early childhood disease and things like that was pretty high, and their son lives to maturity. I mean, Peter lives into his
Right.
Peter, that's right. But it's surprising that that you only have the one kid, but it's also surprising that she remarries, live in Elizabeth, and basically, doesn't like crowds, doesn't like noise. I mean, wants to be kind of a recluse in the Tony Wilds of Elizabeth, New Jersey. But she's really interesting. But the economic piece too, which isn't one that I broke down particularly much with. But I mean, she's making those she's making those decisions. She has people that have to execute her decisions, but she's making those decisions.
Yeah, definitely a stronger, independent woman than I thought, making economic decisions. So, the reason I brought that up is here's a letter I found that actually alluded me to looking at this a little more about the debt between England and the United States. It's a letter in April 5th, and it's basically in 1788. This is more than a few years after the war, because in 83 it's pretty much said and done. This is a letter that he writes his wife back and forth about his English debt. So it made me go like, why is this guy? He is the head of, the cashier of this bank. Why is he owing debt to the English? Shouldn't he not care? So here's the quote that I have. It says, I don't know if I should do this in a British accent or not, but I'll just do it normal. I owe Carolina, including my sister's debt, $4,500. I can sell my land in Helena immediately for $700. I don't think it's enough. If I could get the debts due to me selling the land on Helena and making good crop, I should go off and pay all my debts, except for my English debt, which I don't mean to pay, till I sell my lands. I suppose I owe them $3,000. Without touching my active property, I have 9,000 acres of land to pay with. So I go, this is interesting. Like, even if he owed money to England, why should he respect the pay it back? Essentially what we're taught in schools, we won, we wash our hands of it, and we're America. But it's a little more complicated. So I have another letter from one of his friends. This guy is from South Carolina. He was a state judge and a representative for Carolina for a brief time. His name is John I'm saying this right. John Pritchard Grimm. And basically, I'm reading something between them, and it's 1791, September 26th, and he's owing Carolina $6,000. The state of Carolina, which he's part of, Kean's writing to him saying, you owe the British $6,000 worth of debt, and this is from the West Indies. Now, I know we talked about the West Indies before. That's still owned by the British. It's still money to the British. So then I go, these are all personal documents. So I'm like, wow, okay, these are personal documents talking about this. Is this a microcosm? Or is this one incident, maybe? Or is this something connected even bigger? So I go, the only way I can really understand this, and in fact, I have these Kean archives. Let me go and see what are the national and state kind of debt papers. Just the account papers, really. And I wasn't supposed to touch these. I had to ask for special permission. The John Kean now, who was very tight on some of this information, I had to get Aaron to talk to the person. And basically, I am the first student anyway, to kind of look at this information and kind of put it together on real numbers. Because you got to understand, a lot of the scholars, especially the historiography you read, a lot of them are going off of secondary sources. So this school is kind of special with the accounts of John Kean because you're discovering it through John Kean, and you're seeing something that's actually more of a validated proof instead of saying, oh, I heard it from this source or that source. It's like, no, these are the papers from that time period. It's irrefutable. So anyway, here is this document from the state of Massachusetts about the return that's paid back. This is in 1793, 31st of March. Now, there's with all of these, there's percent on loans that also make up for a certain percentage of stock that's owned. So even if the British, we owe the British whatever, they actually seems to me that they own a little bit of stock. Any debt that's paid back is linked to a certain amount of stock. So there's 6%, 3%. The Massachusetts with 3%, and this is a total, it's $2 million or $500,000. 6% was pretty close to $3 million, just under. The total combined of $5,500,000. $34. So basically, that's what Massachusetts pays as a whole. So then you look individually, you're seeing Dutch, French, British. This is initially what I saw. And the return has 2 Dutch corporations. Okay, that makes sense, because they were on our side. $21,000 paid on 6% interest. There's $9,300 on a 3%. Then the French have 20 corporations. And you're like, okay, well, they were our biggest ally. Makes sense. They were definitely French loans. But the British were 13 corporations, and we owed them $58,000 plus dollars. And then the 6% interest was $160,000 plus dollars. And that's more than the 20 French corporations. They got more than the Dutch, and it's second under to the French. And this is where it was really eye-opening to me. I'm like, okay, this is a lot of money. This is not 6,000 anymore. This is an absurd sum of money that even at the time, 3,000 is a lot at the time. 6,000 is a lot at the time. But 50, even 100,000, we're talking like, what is that equivalent to? Almost $1 million now? What is that?
I
don't know either.
You have the Custer and Menard book in your bibliography. That's probably the
yeah,
best.
You're probably right. I could have probably looked at
That's
that.
I think it goes to 1789. I have it on my shelf somewhere. I haven't opened it in a while, but that would be at least the closest you could get to that conversion. I know some other people have published some stuff
Right.
with regard to that too. But
Regardless,
the
it's
math isn't
obscene.
easy. Yeah, it's
It's
a lot of
obscene
money.
amount.
Well, I mean, and it gets into how much debt the colonists were in before. There it is. It's down there. How much debt the colonists were in leading into the Revolution.
Right. I mean, the fact that they own like 11 more corporations than the Dutch, it's pretty, that was astounding. I didn't really think, I mean, it makes sense when you look back because we're part of the English
Right.
Empire.
Well, and all the trade with the West Indies and everything else.
Right. So I kept going to other states, and I'm like, well, let me look at some other states. So then I was Rhode Island. As tiny as Rhode Island is, it owned over $26,000 in the same year. And so then I was like, let's look at South Carolina's return. And that was very small with his friend going back and forth. In truth, South Carolina's, they owed over $230,000, and then they had 58 British corporations, and the Dutch only had 3. And there was only the Dutch had 13, there were 3 French. So now you have, this is even bigger, the Rhode Island, and it makes sense, it's close to the water and stuff, there's ports and go in and out for corporations.
Well, I mean, but it was wealthy. I mean, South Carolina is the wealthiest mainland colony, so it makes sense.
Oh,
that they
really?
would
It was the
have-
wealth?
Well, I mean, they have slaves and they have
That
rice
makes sense.
and indigo, so they're making the most money. So it makes sense that, and they have the closest cultural ties with back to Great Britain. So I mean, they're buying the most British stuff. So I mean, it
Right.
makes sense that they would have the most indebtedness to.
Them in Virginia, actually, when I looked at the accounts, and I think it was, I'm pretty sure South Carolina, one of them, they had to just settle. They were like, you don't have enough money. I think it was South Carolina. If you
Right.
look, they were like, let's just settle this
Right.
because you're not being able to pay it back,
Right.
dude. It's just
We'll
not.
give you a percentage because otherwise you're not going to get any.
It's not
Yeah.
crazy. It's an entire state. It's not an individual. It usually happens when you think individuals in court. Or you owe money to a
Right.
credit
Well,
card.
and South Carolina's also been out of shape because they felt like a lot of their slaves got stolen by the British when they were departing. So
Right.
part of the negotiation is your number's not real because we're going to count
Fascinating.
this property and chattel slaves that you've taken
Wow.
as counting against some of that
Right,
some of
right.
that debt. So every side makes their negotiating position.
Definitely. I mean, it really is fascinating, the connection between that. I mean, economics, still slavery is part of economics, So then, after South Carolina, I was looking like, let's look at Pennsylvania. Let's see how much they owed. They owed over $1 million to the English. I was like, well, that's astounding. It's actually $1,022,200. And then New York had 76 British corporations and owed even more. It was $1,753,000 plus dollars. And so after looking at all these state, returns, I'm like, okay, let's look at the federal returns because that's going to really show that this meant something. Because if it's state, maybe it's just individualized to those states. So then I actually looked, and it was one of the hardest ones to actually look over, and it had the Dutch payments being well over British by like $5 million, and basically it only exceeded the French a little over 50,000. So it still was more than the French's debt for. This is federally now. This is not just for a state. And the weirdest thing, it was very unclear. The corporations, it listed 16, but they had 3 numbers spread, and it didn't really link to say these 3 or this 10 is part of France or part of So what that made me realize is actually we're better at keeping accounts now, definitely. And maybe I didn't have the best eyes to look at it, but it wasn't as easy as the other ones going like, oh, this is England, and the lines are right next to each other. It was above, and there's 3, and they're not exactly, really, it's not exactly like connected to the point where I can understand like exactly who and what corporation numbers. So, after analyzing all these sources, it really goes to show that maybe sovereignty-wise, we had independence, but financially we were still very much tied to England.
Yeah.
You know, like I wouldn't say maybe.
Well, and there's more trade with England in 1790 than there is in 1770, which is astonishing. I mean,
right.
When you get into what is the revolution, the war really change, and the independence really change. I mean, those economic connections, if anything, get tighter.
Oh yeah. You know, it's a really it's much like other things in history too, like. Even the Crusades, you know, after a while, like, they didn't want to fight each other. It was more economic. You know, you're seeing how things go from just being like, oh, you're a colony, but maybe if I just had you pay me money and I don't have to worry about propping you up and looking after you like a daddy, you know, you basically have I would say a financial colony. I can't really say that per se, but it almost seems
Yeah,
like...
I mean, but to a certain extent, it's that colonial. I mean, that colonial relationship lasts into maybe into the American Civil War.
Yeah.
Until the American economy kind of grows to the point that there's much less need for British supplies and British goods.
British goods, yes.
The Treaty of Paris was signed September 3rd, 1783, initially ending the Revolutionary War. There are 10 articles in the Treaty of Paris, and out of the 10 declared, Article 4 sticks out as a claim of how debts should be honored between the two nations. Article 4 of the Paris Treaty states, "It's agreed that the creditors on each side shall meet with no lawful impediment to the recovery of the value in sterling money of all bona fide debts herefore contracted." And with the statement, one has to realize that the United States did not negotiate in a position of power. All the Treaty of Paris did was eliminate America's liability to the King of England, who no longer needed financially to support his western colonies. And the strangest thing is that even with this treaty signed, both sides were not fully accommodated. England wasn't fully paid to the amount of specie gold and silver. The British then pushed for their goods in the markets and issued trading tariffs that prohibited Americans from exporting their goods. Americans were not happy because the British still had bases all over manned with soldiers in places in Pennsylvania and the western frontier that the British refused to leave. However, according to the Treaty of Paris, these were supposed to be abandoned. 13 years after the Revolution, the English still sustained these armed fortresses in the United States, while the English Navy consistently grabbed and kidnapped American soldiers and their goods to serve the Crown's Royal Navy. In the eyes of the British Navy, all the English are supposed to be available for service, even if one of them is on a ship of a foreign nation. So it was not unusual for British Navy vessels to stop American ships probing for English crew. In their search, if they found just a few American sailors and they could not prove their citizenship, they were often taken and forced into custody to serve under the British Royal Navy. Some men were protected from these so-called impressment gangs, which were apprentices indentured to a master, seamen with under 2 years of sea experience, fishermen, and included other maritime trades and industry and sailmakers. However, claiming to be one of these professions was not enough. Each protected individual was made to carry a protection doctrine, documentation that the individual identified them, their name, and their trade. If that person lost their identification, their documentation, could not prove their protection on demand, the press gang would press and kidnap that individual without further questioning and force them into servitude under the British Royal Crown. Between England's pre-war debt not being fully paid in sterling and American ships being seized in the French West Indies by British ships due to a quasi-war with France, one thing was certain, was that there were tensions brewing between these two nations. Out of the two nations, the U.S. primarily could not afford another war. These tensions led to another treaty in 1794 called the Jay's Treaty. Orchestrated by Hamilton, really should have been called the Hamilton Treaty, agreed to pay the King of England £600,000 of sterling for the losses accrued during the Revolutionary War. Reason for the treaty was in the winter of 1793 to 1794, England was upset that America paid its final debts it owed to France before England. At first, John Jay seemed to be an experienced negotiator from his work in the Treaty of Paris. Truth is, the treaty was a list of demands that the U.S. ceded to England. In reality, John Jay was not a big fan of the French and was more keenly sympathetic to English demands. Jay agreeing to British arguments regarding the maintenance of British forts on the northwestern frontier, as well as the repayments of the pre-war debts to British creditors, mainly owed by southern plantation owners. In the treaty, England agreed on limited ports of trade from the United States to the British West Indies, only in promise if the Americans agreed to do all its power to prevent British ships from being taken into enemies' hands if inside a cannon fire shot of the coast. This treaty was controversial and upset the public, stirring tensions between Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, who strongly opposed the treaty. Washington could do nothing, having his hands tied to the war debt, claiming that Jay's treaty may not be the best position of negotiation, but it stopped the real prospect of war. The Jay's Treaty did next to nothing to accomplish the improved shipping concerns, British forts, or impressment of the British Navy. But as unhappy as the people in the first administration at the time was, Washington knew one thing the American people could not afford was another war. The Jay's Treaty was so unpopular with the public, they burned effigies of John Jay in protests, sparking angry farmers also in the Whiskey Rebellion.
So also, when you have to look at this, there's to make a country have to go and pay back stuff, it has to be a treaty of something. It has to be an international treaty, it has to be something like that. So there's only two treaties that are very, very important. As you know, there's the Treaty of Paris, and then there's Jay's Treaty. So after seeing this, I'm like, I gotta look at the Treaty of Paris. I never really looked at it before, and in a class they don't really tell you to read it. But it's so obvious if you look at one of the articles, and I think it's Article 4, let me see it in here. Yes, there are 10 articles, and it's Article 4. It sticks out so plainly, and it says, I quote, "It's agreed that the creditors on either side shall meet with no lawful impediment to the recovery and value in sterling money of all bona fide debts, therefore contracted." So that means, and correct me if I'm wrong, is there shouldn't be any interruptions or laws that stop me paying you or vice versa from both sides.
Well, and that the British could come and collect, like you were talking about, how it's weird that, you know, John Kean on the winning American side still has to pay off his debts to the British, but that's exactly what it, that's exactly what it meant was, okay, we'll stop fighting, you can have your independence, but those debts are still, the debt balance doesn't get wiped away.
Right, you still owe us that money.
Mm-hmm.
So if you study the document pretty closely, you did see that we did not really negotiate that. I think this is the most important. We didn't negotiate that in a position of strength. We negotiated that in kind of a position of more weakness. And one of the things I think is because in the beginning it says that King of England is both the Prince of the Holy Roman Empire and the States. And that's kind of like, almost like a rude, kind of like overzealous, powerful thing to say. And it almost seems like we didn't want to have any more of a war thing. They didn't want to go to war with us. And so it was kind of like, we're going to accept these demands. Yeah, sure, we're whatever.
Well, and the Americans, they knew they didn't have a lot of leverage. They were negotiating independent of France and Holland, which was in violation of the agreement that the U.S. had with France.
Right.
And so, but they, look, there were still, and when those negotiations start, the British, I think we talked about last time, the British still occupy Charleston and New York, and
forts.
There's large, just because Cornwallis's army has surrendered, there's still a large number of British troops, and both sides have, like you said, they've agreed that they want the war to end, but what that looks like, and then how do you get to that point? And look, it's a pretty good deal for both. I think ultimately it's probably a pretty good deal for both sides.
Yeah. I'd say
it makes sense. And then Jay's Treaty. I don't know if you're going to get there.
I am, but you can.
So go ahead.
Okay.
I'll wait for you.
Okay, cool. So this also opened up a lot of charters. So if you owed debt like Virginia, so it was kind of interesting because he does say that I give you the sovereignty, but he doesn't relinquish any gold. He doesn't say I relinquished the business charters and gold. So any debt like Virginia, for example, they have that 1606 kind of charter that they give because there's different charters.
Mm-hmm.
There's different colonies. There's peripheral colonies. There's royal. And there's charter kind of colonies. No, it's royal, periphery. There's three. I forget, I'm missing one. But anyway, Virginia is a charter.
Well, it was, but then it becomes.
Yes, it did. Yes, that is right. It does change.
Yeah.
But this gives any excuse going, oh, you owe us debt. Well, we're going to continue that till
Right.
that's paid.
Right. Well, and it gives you the legal foundation for what you're trying to do there.
That's what it is. Yes. Periphery, royal, and charter. I was right. So now I have to go to the other treaty that we had. You know, if you can look at the Treaty of Paris, and that does say that they wanted. This is all about gold. They did not want any paper. They wanted specie. They wanted all that. So it did. What the Treaty of Paris really did is eliminate the liability of the king that he had on no longer needing to financially support its Western counterparts. It wasn't paid in full, but if you look at the Jay's Treaty, in my opinion, it is a weird treaty because John Jay did such a good job apparently in the beginning with the Treaty of Paris, and he was so, let me say, his experience, because Benjamin Franklin at this point, he's gone, he's a really good negotiator.
Right.
He was the most experienced man they could have used. So using John Jay, they thought that they would have leverage. However, he actually liked the British more than the French, so a lot of the demands were kind of more sided to, and especially this is a big contentment with the people and a lot of people in government and individuals in American society. They looked at John Jay's treaty as like, oh, you're definitely supporting the British.
Right.
more.
No, I mean that was what I was going to say a few minutes ago.
Go ahead,
That-
elaborate.
Well, no, just that Jay's treaty was. I mean, it was really controversial, and there was a ton of opposition to it, but also a recognition ultimately that it was the best. You know, again, that America didn't have a lot of leverage, and that it was probably the best deal that the United States was going to be able to get, and it did secure some of the things that that were most important with regard to trying at least to have peace on the frontier and some things like that were higher priorities.
Did you know, like, look, when I read it said he had no love for the French? Is this true? Like from what I'm reading, it seems that way.
I don't know the Jay stuff as well. Then I mean, Jay is an experienced diplomat. He's ambassador to Madrid. Dr. Hyde's talked about some of that stuff. We've talked. She's talked about some of that stuff, and he spends time in Paris. I think some of it is that the Jeffersonian wing in 1794 is very pro-France, and so Jay giving it gets twisted into looking like more of a sweetheart deal to the British than it really is. But it seems like it's less beneficial to the French.
Right.
But I don't know that I wouldn't categorize Jay as
not
anti-French. I mean, the whole certainly the Federalist Party. France is in revolution, it's by that time you're into the really violent Jacobin phase of the French Revolution,
definitely.
and so most people are at least kind of taking a step back from being as ardently pro France as they had been even a couple of years ago,
Right.
And look, Great Britain is. There's still this love-hate relationship because there's that British identity, the sense of we're founded by the English and that's really important, but also that's who we got our independence from. And so how do you create an American identity that's not rooted in an English identity, but at the same time acknowledge the positives of that British legacy, of that English legacy,
Absolutely.
whether it's government or economics or whatever like
Yeah.
that. So it's, I can understand how it gets to be a complicated story for sure.
Oh yeah. One of the things that was like a lot of people don't realize is Jay's Treaty. It's really organized by Hamilton again, and it really a lot of historians almost want to coin it the Hamilton Treaty because it's orchestrated more, but it's negotiated by John Jay.
Well, don't forget, John Jay is William Livingston's son-in-law.
Yes,
so
exactly.
they're married across the street.
It's all connections.
It's all connections here. It's all connections here.
Always who you know. So really, this is Jay's Treaty is basically it's owing the King of England like 600,000 pounds of sterling for so it's like to me it almost seemed extra. I'm sure they want it anyway, but it's just on top of every other like the numbers I put and then just that. I mean, that's just an absurd amount of money, and it just makes like a leash, in my opinion, even more.
Well, I mean,
tight.
it looks but you're also getting some of the other benefits out on the frontier and additional trade benefits to the West Indies and things like that.
Right.
So it works out.
We're always waiting like when we gonna trade the West Indies,
Right. Well, I mean, it's such a huge market. That's right there.
Right? It's like
right
our
up.
brethren.
Right. No, I mean, it's right out. Yeah.
So even like Washington with the Jay Treaty too, like he got a lot of flack from trying to side with it, but he looked at it as like we got to stop war. We can't have another
Right.
war. And basically, long story short, whether it was a good thing or a bad thing to do, and whether the treaty was bad or good, it was a necessary thing that needed to be accepted because I wouldn't say both sides couldn't handle it, but we definitely did not
Yeah,
able to handle
I think
the
that's
war.
the right way to put it, for sure.
But the impressment issue of the British Navy, and it would actually go into ports and go into American areas, even in the West Indies, where there was some areas where they could stop boats and see if there were Americans on the ship, that if you could not prove your sovereignty or you did not show yourself that, hey, I'm not English, they would take you. They were called press gangs, and they'd press you into service for the Royal Navy. And a lot of times, you know, what we talked about this before, it's an old practice too.
Yeah.
It's a practice that goes to the Middle Ages, you know, medieval times. And that's one of the reasons why England has such a crazy navy. But also one of the reasons why a lot of it drops off, because people run away and don't want to be a part of it.
Become pirates. I mean,
Yeah, right.
100 years before, you've got, they're all becoming pirates.
Exactly. That's another interesting point. So, yeah, it's just it's the whole issue that you think that we basically are free, and then, you know, you have basically still this kind of, you know, kind of like interruption from the British government coming in, taking goods, sacking goods, making sure, pushing people into the service. And also, if certain people were protected. If you had a note with you, it was a protective note. It was only people that were under a master. If you were a seaman under 2 years, so they weren't experienced
Right.
people. And if you were a mass sail builder, ship builder, you were actually protected. But if you went on the ship and they asked you if you had that document, if you didn't have that document, you were still pressed and you were pushed in the service.
Well, and that's the leading cause of the War of 1812.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly.
So you know, that's probably further afield than we need to go. But you know, this stuff between the U.S. and Great Britain doesn't get resolved. There's efforts to be. I mean, they stay neutral as long as they can. Jefferson's able to stay neutral, even though he may or may not want to. But Madison takes advantage of the opportunity to you know, there's kind of a desire for war right up until the war starts, and you see the cost of it. But it's the impressment of sailors and the you know, the British continuing to inhibit American trade and American free trade, whether it's with France, with Britain, or Holland, or whatever. You know, they've been at war with France now for a dozen years, and so that's where you get the war. You know, that's a important cause of the War of 1812.
Right, and
so these treaties they're short-term solutions, but they're not necessarily long-term solutions.
That's almost my argument too in this, is that, you know, you could, and people back then kind of certainly did, you could almost look at it as one war in a sense because of issues.
There's an argument to be made for that, for sure, yeah, because there's some kind of tidying up the other stuff.
One of the most interesting things that linked banking, money, and politics and the Constitution was the missing 13th Amendment. During the early 19th century, the United States made an original 13th Amendment involving titles of nobility, prior to the 13th Amendment today, after the Civil War, that outlaws slavery. The notion of the original 13th Amendment involving esquires, or lawyers with titles of nobility, known as the Titles of Nobility Amendment, or the Tona Amendment. It pretty much was an amendment that was never fully ratified, or, some scholars argue, it was fully ratified, but its process was interrupted by the War of 1812. Although numerous states ratified it after, like Virginia, the amendment is still debated among scholars for the last 30 years, whether it was properly ratified, with the main argument of future states being added and offsetting the process. Even more interesting is that the government had state constitutions that were printed that included the missing Tona Amendment from the 1820s, the 1830s, and nearly almost all the way up to a decade before the start of the Civil War. Either way, titles of nobility emphasizing esquire was such a contentious enough subject that the Senate passed for ratification in the year 1810. The reason was, even though the Constitution stated in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8 about titles of nobility, as well as the Articles of Confederation with their own Article 4, both documentations containing clauses prohibiting titles of nobility in politics, they still never listed any penalties. This made it easy for the King of England to infiltrate the government using esquires that were lawyers beholden to lobby for the king. Even the Associate Law Board was stationed in London and chartered by the king himself. Both the Articles and the Constitution provided 2 weeks to deal with British lobbying, and the Tona Amendment basically outlawed lawyers from being in politics. Adding the impressment issue of the Royal British Navy
and the British forts still stationed in America, and still paying back England after the war, all toppled with inner issues from the bank, showed true reasons that led from the Revolutionary War into the War of 1812, to what many colonists and early Americans consider a continuation of the Revolutionary War.
So this is going to be about the titles of nobility. There, from my research, there was something before the War of 1812 totally breaking out where the original 13th Amendment was established. Before slavery, there was an amendment that were against titles of nobility. Now, we already have it in the Constitution. You have Article 1, Section 9, and it restricts from any titles. The only problem with that was there was actually no penalties. So what happened was it became such a contention of issue of basically titles of lawyers, something we know today as esquires.
Right.
Esquires are unofficial title now. Lawyers just give themselves that. But we got to understand financial system and system of law. This all came from England. So back then, esquires were basically lobbyist lawyers that were beholden to the king. And I know you're thinking like, oh, that sounds far-fetched. Well, the charter, the association board, was stationed in London and chartered by the king. So if you wanted to even be a lawyer, you had to go through a London system. And if you look at Benjamin Franklin, he's an esquire. Look at John Jay. And if you look at a lot of these treaties, it says esquire. Now, basically, I'm not saying that all of them were bad people, but there was a point where this title got a little out of control, where other people in government were basically used to kind of push stuff in our legislation where they were more pro-British, to the point where we were like, we got to get another amendment in there. So basically, it's like 1810, 2 years before the war, April 26, there is, it passes the Senate 26-1. And establishing a certain clause that states, if any citizen of the United States shall accept, claim, or receive, retain any title of nobility or honor, or shall, without the consent of the Congress, accept and retain any present, pension, or office, emolument of any kind whatsoever from an emperor, king, prince, or foreign power, shall cease to be all citizenship of the United States and be capable of holding office, trust, profit under them of either side, or either of them. So that was actually loss of citizenship. There's a real penalty there.
Yeah.
So it makes, you think that this is an issue you don't hear as much, but one of the reasons that makes this so interesting is that this, from my research, was never fully ratified. It was interrupted by the War of 1812, and I can't say it's because of this initially, but basically, the states have a hard time ratifying it. They have the British come in, and then also afterwards, states are ratifying it after, and then the amount of states added offsets the ratification, and pretty much, long story short, it just doesn't become a ratification, but other states are still putting it into printing constitutional books, state-sponsored constitutional books from certain states saying like, oh, there is this TONA titles.
Well, so that's interesting. So they've added, so other states add the clause to their state constitution, and to a certain extent, because I mean that's kind of where I thought that this was going. Was essentially you get to a place where you don't need the law because the problem is
it's kind of
solved, yeah.
Right. So basically, they were just like, what was state's word initially? Let's have it right here. But basically, yeah, the amendment outlawed basically lawyers from being in government, which is kind of interesting to me. So this is a really new, right? So this is on the subject of studying capitalism. But in 1983, there's this guy, David Dodge and Tom Dunn. One guy is, Tom Dunn's a Baltimore police officer. The other guy is a cultural historian. So they find an old, authentic copy of an 1825 Constitution with the TONA 13th Amendment in it. So they see other states have it as well, and they see different publications in about 10 different states printing this, from 1822 to pretty much about 5 or a decade under the Civil War. So you have like 1860 kind of stops, you don't see the printing as much. So they soon discovered that seeing all these constitutions that one of them believes since the ratification with Virginia, they believe that it is ratified. But then you'll see another person who's a lawyer, his name is John Colvin, and basically, it's Joel Silversmith. And he basically says that it seems like it ratified, but really what happens is that the official version of the Constitution, it gives certain members that include that, but the trigger request from, that's what it was, I'm sorry. The triggered request from like Adams and Monroe, they couldn't verify the amendment. So all that happened was
was a mistake. So really, the statutes at large, they didn't really reprint them. They were supposed to reprint them and correct it, but from pretty much 1845, they keep printing these massive amount of books. And so it leads a lot of historians and people, this is a real argument, is this ratified or is it not? And my opinion is, I would like to say yes. But looking at it, it really just seems
Sounds
that...
like it hasn't quite.
What's that?
Hasn't quite crossed the.
Hasn't quite crossed it.
Crossed the threshold.
But another thing I'd like to add is that you have that 27th Amendment, and it was...
That one's a great. That's right. Yeah, I mean that's a great story that it had almost passed and then they pulled
passes
it
way
out.
later,
It passes out. Yeah, they don't die.
Yeah, exactly. So even with this, so the for people that don't know, you have the 27th Amendment. I think it has to do with wages changing in Congress, and then it becomes an actual, ratification in 1992. So you have like 1780 or 89.
It's one of the original Bill of Rights.
Yes.
It doesn't get initially. It's one of the first two, I think, but it doesn't initially get passed.
Right, and that's another great argument. You have it doesn't federally, but not to the states, the Bill of Rights. So if that happened, this Tone Amendment, of course, could be ratified later. But from what I'm looking at, it just seems like a very cool story. Basically, that is my argument, how paper money has made this kind of echelon of a new financial revolution system. It influenced the gold standard, debt, banking, and also the you see connections between this titles of amendment law that the England was wasn't just financial. They were politically still trying to get into our system. And then we were trying to push it away with these amendments, and then you had the forts and the impressment gangs, and you basically have really such an area of contention that you have to now re-put on glasses of the revolution and see it through a new perspective. Going like, oh, it wasn't all peace and love and war.
There's a lot of cool stories in there.
Oh, definitely.
A lot of cool stories in there.
But, basically, that's pretty much what I think everybody should get out of this, is that America really is... This was not about throwing tea in the harbor. It was about an experimentation of kind of an escapism from European banking system into making our own. What this history shows is that American history has always been a compendium of an ongoing battle with privately controlled central banks. Banks that came after, like the Second Bank of the United States and the Federal Reserve, all have currency and banking roots from the Bank of England and conditions with the Revolutionary War that birthed the first bank of the United States. And the debt from central banks never really got sorted out until Andrew Jackson becomes the first and only president to pay off the national debt. And as it says on his gravestone, when someone asked him about his greatest accomplishment, Jackson replied, "I killed the bank." How paper money's influence on currency, debt, banking, and the Constitution has forever transformed itself as a British colony into its own nation. The American Revolution was just as much a political revolution as it was a financial revolution. This new perspective of the revolution should enlighten one to a new sense of patriotism, watered by revolutionary roots of antiquity, giving modern-day connections to problems that Americans face with money, corruption, politics, and government taxation that's still an ongoing battle fought today. Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something. All the information was taken and dedicated to the Kean Foundation from Kean University at Liberty Hall.